Good afternoon, folks.
Good afternoon.
My name is Rebecca Over and I'm from the south of England. It would take too long for me to explain to everybody how come I'm actually teaching a lesson about the McGraw family. Anybody who wants to know is more than welcome to come and talk to me about it at some time over the meal later on. Suffice it to say that I would not be here today talking about the Alabama branch of the McGraw family, one of the most famous 20th century singing families, were it not for the kindness and generosity not only of the Georgia McGraw family, who have adopted me as an honorary member, but for this lesson in particular, three descendants of the Alabama branch of the McGraw family. We are particularly honoured to have with us today Eugenia Ridinger. She is a granddaughter of Lee McGraw, and other people to whom I am indebted are Coy Middlebrooks, a grandson of Lee McGraw, and Lisa McGraw, who is a daughter of Lee McGraw's youngest brother. There is way too much detail to cover to put it all in a lesson, so you'll find much of the nitty-gritty information in her handout. There are two family trees close to the beginning which you might find it useful to refer to during the course of the lesson, and we'll be singing some of those songs on the list there, so if you can be thinking about whether there's any of those you would like to volunteer to lead, that would be really useful. Genealogists agree that the original McGraws probably came to America from Ireland round about the late 1600s or early 1700s. In Ireland, the name is likely to have been pronounced McGraw. Early McGraws lived in South Carolina, Tennessee and Mississippi, and ancestors of our family settled in Georgia round about the early 1800s. The most significant date for us in the history of the pre-singing generation of McGraws is the 7th of October, 1858. On that day in Coweta County, Georgia, Ephraim Wesley McGraw, aged 24, married 25-year-old Jemima Adeline Kildore. On that same day, in the same county, although not in the same place, Thomas Neal Entrikin, aged 18, married 25-year-old Harriet Henrietta Cannon. Both men were farmers, and when Civil War broke out in April 1861, both had young families. Ephraim and Jemima's eldest son, Roland Jackson McGraw, was not quite 2 years old. A daughter was born a month after war began. Thomas and Harriet's eldest child was not quite 1 year old, and Harriet was very heavily pregnant. Both men enlisted to serve in the Confederate States Army, and both survived the war, and you'll find a lot more details in the handout if you are interested. It is Harriet who is the most significant member of that generation for us, because she was the role model for her daughters. And like it or not, most of us women, sooner or later, end up taking after our mothers, don't we just? Harriet was a very strong-willed lady, and it was said of her that whatever she was at, she was the boss. The Entrikin family's story is that when war broke out, Harriet was very heavily pregnant. Thomas wanted to go and enlist straight away, and there was no way she was going to let him do that. One day an officer from the army came to the house to get him. Harriet met the officer at the door, and she ordered him to leave. He said, "I've come to get him, we need men badly." She said, "Well, I need him badly too, I'm heavily pregnant and I've got a small child, I can't spare him yet." No, the officer told her to stand aside. He said, "I need to come in and fetch him." Now, behind the door, Harriet kept a small, sharp axe. She reached behind the door, she got the axe, and she said to that officer, "You cross this threshold and you'll have to be carried out." The officer retreated. The child was born in June 1862, after which Harriet allowed Thomas to go and enlist. He got sick He was furloughed home in 1863, and that's how come their third child and eldest daughter, Augusta Anne Savannah Entrikin, was born on the 20th of July, 1864. On the 26th of September 1879, 14-year-old Augusta Entrikin married 20-year-old Roland Jackson McGraw at Bowden Junction, Carroll County, Georgia. Both Roland and Augusta were singers, and it is so tempting to speculate they may have met at a singing school, but we don't know for sure. And also we don't know for sure who their teachers may have been, but some possibilities are given in the handout. What we do know for sure is that Roland and Augusta both joined the Chattahoochee Convention at Standing Rock Church in Coweta County, Georgia in 1889. By this time, the Entrikins were one of the leading singing families in that area. After the entry on the membership list for McGraw RJ, Augusta appears as Augusta Entrikin, with Mrs. RJ in brackets afterwards, almost as an afterthought. The whole family would have gone to that convention, including eldest child, 7-year-old Lee Andrew McGraw. Also, 5-year-old younger brother Henry Newton, known as Bud, and sisters Mattie, 3, and Roxy, who was not quite 1. In the late 1800s, word came to northwest Georgia of better land for farming in Alabama, and many families travelled west to find it. In October 1893, David Orion Nix, a member of Holly Springs Primitive Baptist Church, where we sing to this day, was granted a letter of dismissal from the church to make this journey with his family. Among them was 12-year-old Louisa Idenia Nix, known as Lou. When the Nix family left, Lee McGraw was 11 years old, and since both families were singers, it's very likely that he and Lou first met at a singing school in Georgia, possibly taught by T.J. Denson. Roland and family remained in Georgia till 1902, when they decided to follow the Nixes and make the journey to Cullen County. By this time they had 11 children, the youngest of whom, Alfred McKinley, was only 1 year old. From accounts of other families who made that same journey, we know that Roland and his family would have travelled by mule-drawn wagon, and it's likely that most of the family walked much of the time. All of their worldly goods, from household items and clothing to chicken coops and food for both people and animals, would have been carried in or tied to the wagon. The family cow or cows would have been tethered to the back of the wagon, or possibly led by one of the children. 20-year-old Lee, who had been working as a labourer on the family farm, must have been a big help to his parents on this journey. The rate of travel was most likely between 8 and 10 miles a day. The family needed to make and break camp, rest and feed their animals, prepare food and do all the necessary chores each day. When you think about it, women in those days had to be incredibly strong. The load on Augusta and her daughters, the eldest of whom was 18, must have been enormous. On Christmas Day in 1902, 20-year-old Lee McGraw married 21-year-old Lou Nix in the community of Jones Chapel in Cullman County, Alabama. After about a year in Cullman County, Roland uprooted the family once again to travel northwest to Lauderdale County. Now, they'd started off in Carroll County, Georgia, which is there. Then they travelled to Cullman. They then went way up to Lauderdale County, right in the northwest corner. That is, so somebody told me, the only remaining officially rural county in the whole of Alabama. Can't remember who told me that. One of the things they would have had to do on that journey is cross the Tennessee River. Today it's wide and slow moving because of the dams. In those days it would have been narrower but pretty fast moving. The only way across was a ferry which had been operated there by John Lamb from around about 1811. They would have had to load the wagon, the animals, all the people on that ferry and cross the river. Roland died on the 30th of June 1910 at the early age of 50. He was the first McGraw to be buried at Anderson Cemetery. By this time, Lee and his family were farming their own plot of rented land, and they remained in Lauderdale County when Augusta and the rest of the family briefly returned to Georgia after Roland died. By 1920, Augusta, who had stayed only a couple of years in Georgia, had returned to Lauderdale County with her two youngest sons. After they left home, she spent all her time travelling between the homes of her various children, staying some months with each. No doubt she timed these visits to coincide with singings, because Augusta was a dedicated Sacred Harp singer all her life. Mind you, the only record I have found of her leading music is at the Mount Zion Memorial in Carroll County, Georgia, on Saturday, July the 21st, 1934. That would have been a very special day, because the day before she celebrated her 70th birthday. There's more information in the handout. Augusta sang treble, something that has been passed down through the McGraw generations, including present-day singers. She knew the whole book from memory, sat on the treble front bench, and often wore a white dress. A family story is that one time Marcus Kegel went to a singing, and he saw her sitting on the treble front bench, and she sang the whole morning without once opening her book. So after dinner he thought, I'm going to sit next to her, see what she's doing. And later, she sang the whole afternoon again without once opening her book. Later he was heard to remark, she had not sung one note or one word wrong. How about that? Augusta died in 1940. She rests in the cemetery at Mount Zion in the same plot as three of her grandchildren who died young. Payne Denson sang in her honour during the memorial lesson at the 1941 session in Mount Zion, but in common with the minutes that Buell was teaching us about yesterday, no song numbers were recorded. It's such a shame. Augusta had lived to see three of her children, Lee, Bud and Tom, and one grandchild, Leon, not only sing, but have three songs that they had composed in the 1936 edition of our book. She must have been especially pleased that Lee chose to name one of his songs Entrikin in honour of her and her family. You'll find Entrikin near the back of the handout. Do we have a volunteer to lead it for us? I'm looking at Warren here. Would you like to? No volunteers? Yeah, go on.
Well, good afternoon. I haven't spoken to you yet. Right, just got here. We'll sing wisdom from wisdom from
you, Warren. Thank you to the class for singing that. That song was actually removed when the 1991 edition was organised. Now we take up the story of Lee Andrew McGraw. Lee soon became an active Sacred Harp singer in the area in and around Lauderdale County. The importance of Sacred Harp in the life of his family and their closeness to the Densons is shown by the fact that he and Lou gave their first son Huelon the second given name of Denson. Unfortunately, there is no evidence whatsoever that he ever had any interest in Sacred Harp despite his propitious name. Lee was one of the organisers of the Tennessee River Convention in 1907, and in August 1908, most likely just before that year's session, T.J. Denson taught a singing school in Anderson. In the handout there's a picture, and there's a larger picture on there which you can look at later on. Among the students were Lee, his younger brother Tom, and other family members, including his father Roland Jackson and his father-in-law David Nix. By 1911, Lee had bought his own land. He and his family lived in a log cabin there while he and friend Andrew McConnell, a house builder and farmer, began to build the house that would become the McGraw family home. Now Lee was able to witch or divine for water. His daughter Mildred later said he could find water pretty much 40 times out of any 45. So that skill most likely was buried where the house was placed, because there was a well house close by. The house was larger than was normal for the times, with 3 bedrooms, a living room and a large kitchen divided into 2. And I wonder whether Lee was already thinking that they would have the need to put up a lot of Sacred Harp singers when they came to visit. The house was located just off present-day Highway 64, between Highway 207 to the east and the community of Grassy to the west. Now, some Sacred Harp minutes, including those of the 1944 centennial that Aldo taught us about, show Lee McGraw as living in Tennessee. The reason for the confusion is, when the family first lived on that plot of land, the nearest post office was Rogersville, which is down to the south here. So their address was Route 2, Rogersville, Alabama. Later on, a post office was built in Miner Hill, Tennessee, which was not far off in this direction. The house had a new address, Route 1, Miner Hill, Tennessee. Much later in the 1940s, a post office was opened in Anderson. The address then became Anderson, Alabama. Lee always lived in this house there. The house never grew legs and wandered across to Tennessee. Lee and Andrew took their time over the house, started in 1911, and it wasn't finished till 1919, by which time Lee and Lou had 2 more children. Lee was first and foremost a farmer, and a successful one at that. He grew corn and cotton and hay for his animals, and on his World War I draft registration card in 1918, which there's a copy on one of, there you can look at later, he gave his occupation as self-employed farmer. He was described as being of medium height, medium build, with brown eyes and dark hair. In both 1920 and 1930, Lee was census enumerator for the area where he lived, and you can look at later, that's a copy of the 1930 form on which Lee enumerated his own family, so we can actually see his own handwriting there. But he had a lot of other jobs as well, and in 1926, Mr. Hamilton opened the first bank in Anderson, a small bank with less than $1 million. Lee was one of the original directors of the bank. Now in 1928, Lee and his brothers Bud and Tom made a homemade vinyl recording. They most likely went to Atlanta to do that. They sang Buell's insidious earworm of a song, The Great Roll Call. That's how Buell described it the other day. And also The Blind Girl, both songs from the James book. We are fortunate to be able to hear that recording today. It's a bit on the crackly side because don't forget this was an old vinyl recording. Now Lee is singing tenor, Bud is singing bass, and Tom is singing treble. And Lee's tenor comes over really well. And the fact that we're able to hear this today is due to the generosity of Charlene Wallace and Richard DeLong.
And what year?
1928. Pause, it says. Come on.
That's it's playing.
I think it's quite amazing that we can still hear Lee's voice today. Give me goosebumps. Lee was a member of the music committee for the 1936 edition of our book, and it made me smile when I saw on the list of the members on a page near the front of the book that the three brothers McGraw were listed in strict order of age, with Lee as the eldest first, and then Bud, and then Tom. During the years that the book was prepared, Lee was not only farming and being a director of the bank, he also served as deacon and treasurer of Bethel Baptist Church, and when the church had trouble paying its bills, he would often pay these out of his own pocket. We know from another family's history that by 1934 he was also working at the cotton gin in Anderson with 2 or 3 other men. Now, I went to visit a cotton gin at a historic farm in Georgia, And I know from the size of the foundations of the Anderson one that it was about the same size. What struck me when I visited that was just how much large and noisy machinery was crammed into a really small space. On one of these there are some pictures you can look at later. But despite being so busy, Lee still found time to write songs. He may well have composed these in the relative quiet of the log cabin, away from the bustle of the main house. He would certainly have tried them out with his family, perhaps on the large porch. He had 2 songs in the 1936 edition. One was Entrikin and the other was New Bethel. I don't think we've got time to sing that now. We'll sing it if we have time towards the end. Yet another job that Lee was doing in the 1930s was that of mail carrier. He started off as a substitute, filling in when the regular man had an off day or holiday. Later he had his own round. During the Great Depression, gas was in such short supply that because of the angle of the gas tank in the mail cart, he often had to reverse up hills in order to keep going. There's another story about his mail carrying days in the handout. In 1951, twin brothers Huron and Hubert Newton arrived in Anderson and set up a barber's shop, which they opened on the last Saturday in July. Huron, who later served as mayor of Anderson, remembers Lee as a friendly, serious, highly respected man who always dressed smartly and certainly did not gossip in the barber's chair. He saw Lee lead music, and he said that although Lee was serious with it, you could really tell that he was enjoying himself. Lee sang tenor, and if anyone had trouble pitching their song, he was the one that they went to for help. A neighbour of Lee's, who was a tiny child at that time, remembers him primarily as a farmer of corn and as a very quiet man. The words he used to me was, like most folks, it took a lot to get anything out of him. But Lee would often be singing, packing up his big black Studebaker car, and would say they were going to a singing. They often went to sing in Tennessee. Although Lou was a singer and she loved Sacred Harp, she didn't want to lead. Neither did daughter Mildred, but Lee did his very best to persuade them. And the family story is that one day both ladies finally gave in, and at one singing, alas we don't know which, I can't find the minutes as of yet, Lou sang one song, daughter Mildred sang 2, and they both said to Lee, that's it, don't want you to pester us to leave anymore. In August 1954, the Georgia McGraws all stayed with Lee and his family for the 3-day Tennessee River Convention, which was held that year at Hurricane Springs Church, next to the cemetery where Roland was buried. Lou was by then very sick. Hugh said she had been sick ever since he began singing in 1953. She was unable to get out of bed. There was not enough room for them all at her bedside, but Lee called out to her, saying they were there, and they all sang for her in their living room, with the doors open so that she could hear it. She died on the 11th of March 1955 and was buried at Mitchell Cemetery, not far north of Anderson on Highway 207. That 1954 session of the Tennessee River Convention was quite a McGraw family affair. Bud was chairman, Tom was vice chairman. Lee sang the introductory lesson with his nephew Ivy Hendricks, who was a son of Lou's sister, Cindy Nix. I wish I had time to tell you more about Ivy Hendricks, but we're a bit pressed for time, so come and ask me later if you're interested about knowing about him. The interesting thing is that Ivy's wife Maggie, who was a formidable and very house-proud lady, is named on the small print list of contributors to the 1936 edition. She's listed as Mrs. D. Ivy Hendricks because Ivy's full name was David Ivy Hendricks. One person whose presence has really shone out through all this is Lee's second wife, Ida Bertha McGraw. She was from a very active Sacred Harp singing branch of the Nix family, and she was a half-aunt of Lou. Their exact relationship is shown on the Nix family tree. Her first husband was Henry Hudson, with whom she had 7 children. She seems to have been way too busy raising them to lead music at that time. Henry died in 1938. In March 1947, Ida married Atlanta singer William Henry Uncle Bill Hardman, and she led music occasionally when she was married to him. She didn't have much luck with husbands, did Ida, because after less than 3 years of marriage, Uncle Bill died, 2 days before Christmas 1949. It was after her marriage to Lee on June the 30th, 1956 at Bethel Baptist Church, when he was 74 and she was 72, that Ida really blossomed as a leader. It seems Lee really inspired and encouraged her. Lee retired from farming and went to live with Ida at her home in the town of Cullman. Their house was within walking distance of the boarding house where Miss Ruth lived. Coy Middlebrooks, son of Lee's daughter Mildred, remembers Ida as a very sweet person who moved about and greeted people almost as if she was about to break into song. She was a petite lady of medium height and often wore a blue dress with flowers on it. Her home in Cullman was neat as a pin and very stylish for the 1950s. She even had a Victrola record player. In the yard there were so many trees that you felt that you were in your own little place when you were there. Lee and Ida sang frequently in the area in and around Cullman County, but sadly they had less than a year together before Lee died on Ida's 73rd birthday, January the 16th, 1957. Lee lay in his coffin in the family home near Anderson the night before the funeral. The funeral took place at Bethel Baptist Church, and he was laid to rest with Lou at Mitchell Cemetery. The final record I found of him as a leader was at the New Hope Joe Myers Singing in Alabama at the end of October 1956, where he sang 210 and 211. After Lee's death, Ida continued to go to singings and she continued to lead music. When she died on November the 29th, 1964, she was buried with first husband Henry Hudson at New Hope No. 1 Cemetery near Jones Chapel, Cullman County, Alabama. Ida's name appears in the 1960 edition as one of the contributors to the book. It looks as if she gave them Lee's song Liberty Grove, which appeared on page 516, dated 1959. The words are described as arranged by Lee A. McGraw. Do we have a volunteer to lead Liberty Grove? It's near the back of the handout.
So I read for all of us.
We didn't finish at the same time, but that's all right. Words.
Did my heart rejoice to hear my friends devoutly say, in Zion let us all rejoice and keep a solemn day. I love her gates, I love her gates, and all the church and her praise. Spends life as a lace built for God to show his strongest face.
Mineville, Tennessee, there it says. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Steve. Lee and Lou's fifth child was Edgar Leon McGraw, who preferred to be known as Leon, born on June the 21st, 1917. He's the only one of Lee's descendants to have been a Sacred Heart composer. When Leon was only 2 or 3 years old, Lee and Andrew McConnell finished the big house, and the family moved across to it from the cabin. Toddler Leon caused his mother a good deal of worry because he would often wander back to the cabin on his own. As a young man, Leon was very outgoing and loved to play pranks on people, and I think Eugenia has a story that she's willing to share with us about that.
Leon was always into something, and so he decided he would dress up in his mother's clothes and coat, and he come walking down the road, and she's looking out the door, and she says, I don't know who it is. And he comes up to the door, and she opens the screen door, and he talks to her for a while, and she never realizes that it was Leon. But he just went on just talking away, and I thought it was just funny.
Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Well, my mother was Mildred McGraw, and she enjoyed going to the singings, and as a child, I was going to the singing with her, but she never explained to me what Rebecca has explained to me. I was just, okay, we went to the Fasola singing, that's all we did. And they went Fasola, and that's all I knew. But we would always go to New Hope every year, and we'd go to Coleman. But I didn't know a lot about it, and Mother always kept very active in knowing what the minutes and going to singings on Sunday afternoons, and she enjoyed that a whole lot, so she had a whole lot of interest in all that. But she said that she has in her book where she led a couple of songs, but she was really close to her dad, and she was like a change of life child, so there was quite a bit of difference in her brothers and her. And so most of the pictures you see of them is her and her father. So I think there was a very, very big bond right there with them. But she didn't marry until she was 27. And she said that she was going to go to college, and her dad said he thought she should just stay at home. So she stayed at home. And so she always kept with what he said.
On April the 6th, 1938, Leon married Johnny Fay Richardson, with whom he later had 3 daughters. And by the time of the 1940 census, the young couple were living in Auburn, Alabama. Lee graduated from Auburn University, where he later became a member of the staff, and he's best known in wider circles for his academic career and achievements, which are listed in the handout for those of you who may be interested. He inherited his father's love of farming and specialised in agricultural studies. Lee's wife, Johnny, is remembered as being a very proper person. One time when she and Leon came to visit at Lee's home, she went to the outhouse and came running back into the house, screaming. There was a hole in the back of the outhouse, and a rooster had pecked there. Lee's postal address was a source of confusion when Leon was discharged from the army, which he had joined in 1945 due to the Second World War. When he was discharged, Leon wanted to be taken to his father's home, where presumably his own young family were also waiting for him. Against his protests, the driver took him to Miner Hill, Tennessee, because army regulations stated they had to take soldiers to the town of their postal address. Leon eventually managed to convince the driver to take him to Anderson. It seems he didn't lead music that often, and in his retirement years he didn't travel much to any all-day singings. He kept in touch with Sacred Heart by occasionally going to monthly evening singings in Auburn, where he sang tenor. He is remembered by others there as being a very quiet, unassuming and likeable man. Those who did not know would never have guessed then that he had composed one of the songs in our book. When the 1936 edition of the book was published, Leon was only 19, and yet he had already composed at least one song. His Ode First appeared on page 295 in the 1936 edition, and it remains on that page to this day. He named it in honour of Lonnie P. Oden, who Buell mentioned the other day, a friend of his father Lee, who finally had the 1936 edition and went on to build Oden's Chapel at St. Joseph, Tennessee. Who would like to lead 295 for us now? We have a volunteer.
295.
295.
So it was his daddy that was a water witch, right?
Yes.
So there we go. That's appropriate.
Leon died on the 10th of December 1987 and he was buried at Auburn Memorial Parks. That is an enormous cemetery with all flat memorials, and his grave holds the record for me as being the one it took me the longest time to find, almost 3 hours. When I was looking round for a landmark by which to find it later and tell other people how to find it, I saw a large magnolia tree close by. I went to have a closer look at that, and underneath that magnolia tree I found a family of stone chickens. You'll find the story in the handout. I like to think that Leon, with his wicked sense of humour and his love of farming, would have been amused that a family of stone chickens could be used as a landmark to find his grave. It seems that not all Lee and Lou's other children grew up to be Sacred Heart singers. Eugenia's very kindly told us about Mildred, who was their youngest child and their only daughter. The only other of their children who appears to have been a singer was second son Aubrey, who was born in 1906, and he grew up to be a farmer like his father. He led music at the 1949 session of the Mount Zion Memorial. He died in 1972, and he and wife Annie rest in the cemetery at Bethel Baptist Church beside their son, James Earl. As I said, Hewland Denson Mcgraw, he should have been a singer, shouldn't he? But he wasn't. In the handout, you'll find an amusing story about his wife. He did follow Lee into the postal service, and he served as postmaster of Anderson from 1945 until his death in 1970. Now, Buell gave us a session about minutes, and one of the frustrating things about the minutes is that usually only the leaders and officers are mentioned. We have no way of knowing who else might have been there. So we don't know for sure exactly how many of Lee McGraw's brothers and sisters sang Sacred Heart. We all know that younger brothers Bud and Tom, two of our most well-known composers, settled in Georgia and founded generations of singing McGraws. Descendants of Bud McGraw and his son Buford, who Buell told us those wonderful stories about, sing regularly to this day. Now Lee's uncle, William Alexander McGraw, younger brother of Roland Jackson, was the grandfather of Hugh McGraw. You'll find full details in the family tree on the handout. 3 other children of Roland and Augusta decided to settle in and around Lauderdale County, but we don't know whether any of them were singers except the youngest child, Alfred McKinley McGraw. His name appears on the attendance list of that Sacred Harp Centennial celebration that Buell taught us about at the courthouse yesterday. He didn't lead. Both Alfred and his wife Otha died tragically in the same car accident on April the 2nd, 1960. Alfred was 58 and Otha was 60. They were buried at Mitchell Cemetery. Their eldest child, Albert Jackson McGraw, born on October the 8th, 1921, grew up to be a lover of Fasola singing. He made the trip with Lee to the 1949 session of the Mount Zion Memorial, where he led music, and he also led a 2-song lesson at Orion Chapel in 1952. He served with the US Army during World War II, and he very nearly didn't make it home. One time, he was among 100 troops sent into a part of the Philippines to remove what was thought to be 50 to 100 Japanese. In fact, there were 500 Japanese, and Albert found himself hiding in a rice paddy in dirty, infected water for 3 whole days. When the troops were leaving, someone noticed he was missing and said, "We can't leave Mac." Another soldier went in to fetch him and carried him out, slung over his shoulder. Albert married Westell Mosley in 1955 and would go to singings with her to sing or to listen, but usually not to lead. He was probably way too busy to have as much time for singing as he might have liked. He was a school teacher in Lauderdale County for 36 years and also coached junior high basketball. He wrote articles for the local newspaper and continued his own studies in later years. Albert loved breeding fancy poultry, an interest which began when a special aunt, and he doesn't say who, can't help wondering who it was, gave him a little red hen when he was only 4 years old. He would exchange birds with other breeders by packing them into a suitable type of box, taking them to the post office in Anderson and sending them through the post. He did, and he received birds from other breeders in exactly the same way. He loved gardening, and according to his obituary, he raised a beautiful garden every year without failure. When he died on September the 7th, 2006, he was buried at Mitchell Cemetery. I think we've got time to squeeze in 2 more songs. So would anybody like to lead 395 for us? Do we have a volunteer?
395.
395? I'll lead it if no one else wants to.
You bet. I think so.
Yeah, please.
You want to introduce it?
And we'll repeat the last. Let's sing.
Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of His grace.
My gracious Master,
My gracious Master, and my God. Jesus, the name that turns our drinks the power of Kansas City, the prisoner free. His blood can make the foulest weak. His blood availed for me. He breaks the power. He breaks the power of Kansas City. His blood can make the foulest flee. His blood availed for me.
Thank you, Richard.
First read ain't bad.
I've had to leave out quite a lot of what I planned to say because of we started late and we really need to eat, don't we? But I think you'll find everything that I had to leave out of the talk in the handout. I'd like us to sing now to more or less end the lesson. 274 bottom, Royal Jordan. This is the song that was sung by Augusta's nephew, Tom Entrikin, who was son of that elder brother, George Washington Entrikin, in memory of Lee during the memorial lesson at the 1957 session of the Mount Zion Memorial Singing. Do we have a volunteer to lead 274 on the bottom?
Yeah, go ahead. You kill yourself?
No, please.
You go ahead.
No, I couldn't keep my way to a paper bag. All right.
once again Eugenia Riding for coming to share her stories with us today. Can we give her a round of applause? And I'll leave these up till after I've finished eating anyway, so do come and have a look, and if there's anything you'd like to ask, call me at any time later on. Thank you for coming. I'm just as interested in the history and the families and the composers as I am in the actual singing. So this is ideal because we get everything here.
What's your what do you think about the accommodations, the food, sort of the setting?
The accommodation is great and the food is wonderful. And of course, for me, when I'm out here, I'm driving on the different side of the road. So to park the car and not have to drive for 3 whole days is absolutely wonderful. And just to be able to walk everywhere and not to have to worry about logistics, just concentrate on the learning. Yeah, so it's ideal.
Good.